co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, You Shall Have No Other Gods, the Book of Exodus. Today we'll be talking about Lesson 7 of our study, which covers the Book of Exodus, Chapter 7. As we left off, Moses and Aaron were just ready to go to start the conversation with Pharaoh. Going into this, we know ultimately Pharaoh is going to let the people go. What we don't know is how that's going to happen. And we're meant to have a fair bit of apprehension and tension around how that should work in the text. Too complicated. Not only is Pharaoh somebody who is inherently in a position where he doesn't have a great deal of interest in the idea of letting all of his free slave labor go. But we see additionally that for reasons that can be a little complicated to unpack, God actually stirs up Pharaoh's backbone and resistance and makes this all take longer and be harder than it needs to be. That can be a thing that's hard for us to wrap our heads around, right? Why would, if God could easily get Pharaoh on board and just let all of this happen, why would he do it a harder way instead of doing it the easy way? That can't be right. We like to do things easily. God doesn't care about the difference between easy and hard. There isn't a thing that's hard for God, right? Like, it's more steps. That doesn't mean it's harder. So first. Second, he's not doing it for Pharaoh, right? Like, what is the goal of what he's doing here? Is it just God is bummed that his people are in Egypt instead of the land of Canaan, and he really needs them to change their address before they can start building a relationship? God does not care about their address, right? Or even whether or not they're slaves. Peripherally that. Peripherally also the address thing. There's a covenant at play. It's a little overstated to say he doesn't care, but it's not his goal, right? His goal is to have a relationship with these people. All of this other stuff is a means toward that end. If he just comes in and, quickly just snatches them up and puts them in Canaan, what has changed about the people? We know they don't currently have the relationship with God that he wants them to. If you pick them up, put them somewhere else, what's going to be different? Answer, nothing. So this whole road out, the Exodus, what that means is not about we're going to be in the promised land now and won't that be great? And it's not about even physically how do we get there. It's about what do we do with the people along the way to try to get them toward a relationship with God. And it seems that God has deemed that longer time in Egypt and more display of his great power over the Egyptians is a meaningful foundation for building that relationship. So he's willing to take extra steps here in delivering the people so that they have more examples of who he is and what he can do. They don't know anything at all right now about that, right? Because again, he's the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And he didn't do, we read back on that, some of the things that we know about who God is, and some of the things he does, for example, here in the book of Exodus. There are some miracles in those earlier books, but they're pretty small. It is mostly the things that the patriarchs do in response to listening to God. There are a few things like Sodom and Gomorrah, and there are a couple bigger things, but like the big deal thing that happens with Joseph is still like Joseph does as much of it as God has seemed to be doing. God is very much working through the patriarchs through most of those books. There haven't been like huge displays of the power of God. That's what we're coming to now. But it's easy to forget that hasn't really happened. There was the flood, but that's passed out of memory, right? There are some things, but by and large, that's not who God has been to these people. So as they're getting to know God, it's helpful that they get to know a new side of him. It's very helpful because there are going to be life and death consequences to forming a relationship with God. I think that's part of the reason all of these signs and plagues have to do with life and death. Is because that's what they're foreshadowing and leading up to, right? Is you have gods of different things in different cultures back then, right? What God is ultimately the God of is life and death, and everything else. But like at his heart, in terms of how your relationship with God goes and what that means, he's about life and death, specifically life. Relationship with God means life, and anything else means death. It's a big deal. And these plagues show that power of God over life and death in many, many ways. So that when you get out of the land of Egypt and God says, hey, I want to enter into a covenant with you, and if you'll keep it, you'll live, and if you don't keep it, well, you saw, there's more weight to that, right? But if, again, they'd just been like deposited at the base of the mountain, Mount Sinai, and God said, cool, you guys want to enter a covenant? If you keep it, you'll live. If you don't, you'll die. Like there's a whole lot less meaning and context to that, right? So this is laying an important foundation for the Israelites. I don't think he's doing it to necessarily overpunish the Egyptians. It's just that like, he's trying to get first the Israelites and then through them all other peoples on board with worshiping and serving him. And this is how he needs to do that. Cast of characters. Although we have started to shift the frame to have more to do with the people of Israel, for some of these interactions here for a bit, we're going to shift back to the Moses and Pharaoh dynamic, and for now the Moses and Pharaoh and Aaron dynamic. As we left off, Moses didn't feel comfortable talking to Pharaoh directly. And so we have said, as the text is reminding us, Moses is going to talk to Pharaoh, or to Aaron, tell Aaron what to say, and Aaron's going to talk to Pharaoh. Which again, if Moses is worried about, not having the right words to say, isn't helpful, because Aaron's still saying the words that Moses is saying. It does seem to be more of a public speaking sort of thing, maybe. But we'll see what happens with that too. At any rate, we are doing a really odd and interesting thing with that, right? So what God intended, I'm your God, you're my prophet, you go talk to Pharaoh. When Moses said, I can't do that, and they made the accommodation, you're not just switching the Aaron role, right? You're not just going God, Moses, Aaron, Pharaoh, as you'd think. You're just going Moses, Aaron, Pharaoh. And see, I make you as God to Pharaoh, you Moses. Right? So in shifting the roles around, in order for Aaron to take the Moses role, Moses takes the God role. And Aaron your brother shall be your prophet. And the role that we're putting Aaron into is here called prophet. The role Moses is doing is the example, truly the example of prophet and a fascinating precursor to Jesus Christ, right? The prophets are always as God to the people that they're talking to, right? They speak as for God and as God does, right? For people who don't have God present or able to talk to them, the prophet stands in and says, I'm gonna be God now. For your purposes, what I'm telling you, that's what God is telling you. I'm serving as God for you right now. Get your act together, right? So this is the first case of that, but this shift of how that role works puts Moses in a position that other prophets later also assume, which is acting as God to the people, or on God's behalf so much that for all practical purposes, there's no difference. That's crazy, right? But of course, the true fulfillment of that is when it is God, right? Like Moses isn't God. He acts as God to Pharaoh by one time dispensation from God. This is how we're going to do it, and I'm okay with it. But Moses is very much not God. What happens if instead you have somebody who is God? The way God sets this up puts Moses in, God is really clever about how all of this works, because what he wants is Moses speaking for him. And Moses says, I can't do that. So what he does is, okay, well, you're going to be like me here, and then Aaron will be like you. But Aaron's not like Moses, ever. But he gets Moses to assume everything that he wanted Moses doing as a prophet, right? As part of the deal. It's, okay, here's how the deal works. You're going to represent me. And then Aaron will be representing you. And then, pretty quickly, we get rid of the third wheel. Fifth wheel, the extra guy, and we just have Moses, but Moses has agreed to do what God wanted in the way that God wanted him to do it, right? He's acting as God. God uses the idea of, we've got Aaron here to convince Moses to take the role the way God wanted Moses to do it. And then Aaron falls out of the picture, and Moses is still in exactly the place that God wanted him, doing it how and why God wanted him to. So the shift that happens here that's important is not that Aaron is acting as a prophet, because he's not really very well, and that goes away pretty soon, as we'll see. The shift that matters is Moses is acting as God to Pharaoh, and that is a prophet, not whatever Aaron's doing. What Aaron's doing is not how God wants his prophets to be. What Moses is doing is how God wants his prophets to be. But God uses this extra layer of abstraction to drill that point across and to kind of almost sneak Moses into doing what he wanted, to get just a little bit ahead of ourselves. But then a prophet is only as good as he is able to represent God to the people, right? And they do a pretty good job, all of them. The kings and the judges and the priests have more examples of failure. The judges are pretty good most of the time. Have at least as many examples of failure as they do of success. There are very, very few. You can't be a failed prophet, because then you are a false prophet, right? You cease to be a prophet when you fail. You don't cease to be a priest because you have a bad relationship with God. You don't cease to be a king because you have a bad relationship with God. But by definition, your prophetness comes from your relationship with God. If you lose your relationship with God, you lose your prophet. You're not a prophet. You can't be a bad prophet. You can be a false prophet, but you can't be a bad one because of how all of that works. So we don't have failing prophets. We have false prophets, but we don't have real prophets who are failing because they wouldn't be real prophets. And you also have relatively few of them for that reason, right? You have a lot more of all of those other things than you have of prophets. It's a hard thing to be a prophet. But this is the first time that we really see some comment on what it means to be a prophet, and the guy who's called a prophet in it is not the one who's doing it, which makes it so interesting. But yeah, that's our dynamic going into this, and kind of who, what, why. So, God speaks to Moses, speaks to Aaron, speaks to Pharaoh, and then what? Pharaoh joyously responds, says, thanks for the message from God. Didn't know. Happy to let the people go. Sorry for any confusion. Here, have some stuff on your way out. Definitely not. We start to only roughly depict the picture, some of the picture of what's going to happen here, which is, but I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand upon Egypt and bring forth my hosts, my people, the sons of Israel, out of the land of Egypt. There's the thing people here rightly get caught up on is the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. Free will is a thing, right? Like, all of this depends on it, right? Like, it is an inviolable thing, right? Like, you cannot be human and not have free will. Like, it's because you can't love, and right, like, we're image and likeness of God. That capacity that is human, that is in the image and likeness of God, is our ability to love as God loves, which we can't do if we can't choose freely, which we can't do if God in any way constrains our will. The whole thing is set up that our will has to be free, and that is an essential part of what it means to be human. And it's so many things we think, oh, God could just solve this by compelling or forcing this person to do that thing. And he could, but it would undermine the entirety of creation if one time God forced one person to do a thing that person wasn't otherwise going to do. Like, literally, that would undermine the sum total of everything that's been created if God ever once did that. He won't do it. So we read this then, and we think, and the friction point is God overriding the free will of Pharaoh by hardening his heart? Because that is a very unappealing idea to what we know about God and humanity. Like, that would be a problem. Right? Like, that would be a massive problem. That would be a way bigger problem than all of what he does to the Egyptians in the plagues. So what is happening? The way I find helpful to think about this. Again, I think the book of Exodus is very psychologically profound for its time, and understood some things that there weren't words for yet, right? Some concepts. thing that I think can be helpful is to view Pharaoh as a massive narcissist. Um, but even if he's not, it's easier to understand and to explain if he is, but the same logic works either way. Don't know how many of you all have interacted too much with massive narcissists. Hopefully, not all of you, not too much, because especially not in close familial relationships, because I'm led to believe that's awful. A thing about narcissists is they're actually very easy to manipulate, right? Like, because they're so transparently predictable in how they'll respond to some things, right? Even if it's crazy and seemingly irrational and like just not good, like there are levers that can be pressed that pretty well have, you're going to generate this narcissistic reaction now when that lever gets tweaked. That's still a thing that they choose, right? God, Pharaoh is a narcissist. God can throw up Moses in front, this meek, humble Moses, and kind of press a couple buttons here and there. And despite the fact that Pharaoh knows all of these plagues are bad and all of these things that are happening to his people are bad, he's incapable from his character of being able to say, you know, guys, you have a point. This has gone too far. I apologize. Why don't you just go? Like, it's not a thing that the Pharaoh is capable of as who he is. It doesn't mean God is forcing him to do anything, though, right? Like, for an all-knowing God, anything he does that interacts with a person, he knows what's going to happen, right? That doesn't mean he makes it happen. He can know he does X, you do Y. It doesn't mean he made you do Y. You still did Y. You still chose it, but God still chose to do X as well and got you to do Y, right? But there's the loop in there where you still made a choice. God knowing the choice you're going to make doesn't mean you didn't make free choice. So Pharaoh, God has Moses do X to lead to Pharaoh doing Y, which is for quite a while not letting the people go, because that's what God needs for his people to happen. God uses Moses to push Pharaoh's buttons to get the outcome he wants, but Pharaoh still very much is making those choices, right? They're bad choices, and Pharaoh is a personality that easily leads him to make those bad choices, but he's still the one doing it, and he's still responsible. So how is God hardening Pharaoh's heart? God is just having Moses do the things that are poking at Pharaoh in the places where Pharaoh gets riled up and can't do it, can't let them go. No, you're not going anywhere. I'm in charge, right? All evidence to the contrary. And no, like he can't do it. Similar situation is at play with Judas Iscariot, right? Does Jesus make Judas betray him, or in any way, shape, or form overwhelm or overcome his will? Absolutely not. Does Jesus pull Judas aside and try to mollify him and say, hey, you know, I've seen that you've been struggling with what we're doing here a little bit, and I know this is hard for you, and there's some disconnect between you and me about this Messiah thing and this journey we're on, and, you know, maybe we can figure it out, and, you know, I can help with that? No. Does he instead if not, he certainly doesn't take steps to prevent Judas from betraying him and does probably poke a few buttons here or there as well. It's exactly the same sort of deal though, right? Like if you're all knowing, you can't interact with anybody without knowing how they're going to respond to what you do. When we don't always know that, we treat it like, I think we impose onto God an idea, how could you possibly make this person do this thing? Well, every time God interacts with a person, he's making them do a thing because he knows what they're going to do, right? Like, you and I don't have that problem, right? If I see that as it would have to be compelling somebody's will to get them to do the thing that I want them to, because I have no control over that and I don't know enough about how their minds operate to guarantee I get an outcome, a certain output from a particular input. But God knows that all the time. It doesn't make you not have free will, but he knows this happens, you do this. He knows that. So every time God does anything, he knows what's going to happen. So it's not, there's no undermining of free will just because he interacts with a person and the person does what God thinks the person is going to do, because God is all-knowing. It's our problem with this is we can't do that, right? And our mind doesn't work like God's does. So we think if you approach somebody and you do a thing that gets them to do the thing you want them to know, then you manipulated them or overwhelmed their free will. And it's just not true, because in every interaction, God is doing some form of that. It doesn't have to be manipulative, and it certainly doesn't have to undermine free will in the cases where God does it. But it's a very hard thing for us to wrap our minds around, because we're not God, and our minds don't work as God's does. So this can be a challenging idea. I'm going to talk about, through these videos, Pharaoh as a narcissist, because I think that helps explain a lot of his behavior. You don't have to think that, though. And it works either way, right? Pharaoh could be a calm, well-reasoned individual, and the same process of God having Moses provide the right inputs to get the right output from Pharaoh would still be accurate. It's just easier to track how it's going on if Pharaoh is a narcissist, and he sure shows a lot of those signs. This one's real straightforward. The only thing worth noting is these guys are a lot older than we might originally think. We're not, especially when you consider all of the time they're going to be wandering in the wilderness. They end up very old by the time this is done. They start very old, especially for their day, and end up very, very old. It also means Moses spent a long time living not right around in Egypt, right? The story reads like, oh, he ran away when he was a young man, and then he came back a little while later. But he went from being a young man kind of leaving the palace for the first time to coming back in his 80s like that. Like, a lot happened, right? He has a lot of life behind him, as does Aaron. It matters not greatly to the story, but it's useful to keep in mind. These are not young guys. Back to these signs. God is at least preparing them a little bit here, suggesting that Pharaoh is going to ask for proof via a miracle, and here's what you should do. We already talked a little bit about what the serpent, the staff to a serpent and back, the hand leprosy and back, and the little bit of water into blood meant in the broader scheme of how those have to do with life and death. So we'll leave that alone a little bit until we get to the last one again, and it's a little different. But for this one, that's what happens, right? they've started the conversation with Pharaoh, and they're starting relatively, as we see, pretty small in terms of signs, and pretty harmless. We'll just take the staff and make it into a snake. That should be sufficient, right? But we've already said they're going to have to do a bunch of signs because God's going to harden Pharaoh's heart. So the Egyptians are not impressed by the fact that Aaron made a snake out of his staff. Pharaoh summons his wise men and sorcerers and magicians, and they did the same by their secret arts. The question here is, like, are they by some kind of magic or something imitating a miracle of God? I think that answer is no. And I'm going to use an example as we go through a bunch of these that I think is funny, but also probably not too far from how I view the truth of this. Which is, I imagine when this happens, like magicians, like with the big flowing robes, and as a lot of these things come up, I think of, like, the ones that they seem to be able to do are all the ones where you could have something up your sleeves. And they're never able to undo, right? Like, if Aaron can turn his staff into a snake, and they could come, again, we talked about, that wasn't the important part of that sign, right? The important part was taking the snake and turning it into a staff, because that's it's overcoming temptation. If a magician can sleight of hand throw a snake out of their sleeve and make it look like they created the snake, that wasn't the important part of it anyway. The important part was grabbing the snake and having it be a staff, which they don't do. They routinely and repeatedly don't undo these things, right? If they really had power over them, they could undo. But all they do is snake. And it really does seem like smoke and mirrors, right? Like, you can read this and think, what on earth kind of dark arts and devil worship and all kinds of stuff might have been going on? Like, God is the only one who has the power to work these signs, right? And they're not with God, and it's not like their snake god is around and helping them make snakes, because their snake god isn't real, right? Like, there's no means by which they could make snakes out of nothing any more than I can. It's not like it was a different time and there was magic back then and there's not now. Like, no. This has to be fake, right? Like, it's a problem to say it's not fake. And it does very conveniently only happen in ways that seem like they would be susceptible to sleight of hand tricks. And they're never able to undo anything. So it seems to me like all of this is a bunch of trickery, and we're going to treat it that way, and maybe have a little fun with it along the way. But for now, they probably didn't wear big flowing robes, but it sure is a funny image to think of these guys with a bunch of snakes and frogs and stuff coming out of the sleeves of their robes. But the important part, like, Pharaoh at least says, see, my guys can do it too. And, like, he's not concerned about the fact that they're not undoing it. He's not concerned about the fact that, Aaron's snake was clearly way more robust than the other snakes. He's like, yeah, close enough. I'm unimpressed. And so, one down. So far, Pharaoh unconvinced. Here we have a number of shifts. First one, Moses. God says to Moses that Moses is going to be the one talking to Pharaoh, right? So we change how we tried one time, Aaron speaking for Moses, that they probably figured out that's really awkward, right? It's a very high stakes game of telephone to have God talk to Moses, who's whispering to Aaron, who's talking to Pharaoh. They're over that pretty fast, especially if Aaron's just saying exactly what Moses said anyway. Like, what's he doing? So we're getting rid of that one pretty quickly. We're also escalating our signs pretty fast. Pharaoh had his chance to do to respond to the really low impact, doesn't really hurt anybody sign here with the staff, and had no interest. We're upping the stakes a lot. We're going to skip right over that leprosy thing. That one very deliberately involved hands in a robe. We know those magicians can figure that out with their sleight of hand tricks, literally. Sorry. So we're just gonna skip having to go through all of that one anyway, and we're gonna get right to the big stuff. And this is the one that counts as the first plague, and that is we're going to, the sign we talked about before was going to be like a little like copper bowl of water could get turned into blood. Apparently we're skipping over the amount as well, and instead of like a cup, we're going to go with the Nile. And we're going to turn the Nile River to blood. That's really quite the escalation here, and sets the tone for what's to come for sure. So that's what God is proposing to have Moses suggest is going to happen next. Couple things here. Aaron is still the one acting at this point. So as the Lord says to Moses, say to Aaron, do this thing. Second, we're not just going with the Nile. It appears that we've decided to go even bigger than that. Take your rod and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over their rivers, their canals, and their ponds, and all their pools of water, that they may become blood. And there shall be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, both in vessels of wood and in vessels of stone. And this is all the fresh water is turning into blood. We'll talk more about what that means in a bit, but we'll get to more of the sign first. So, Moses and Aaron do what the Lord has commanded, and all of the waters in the land of Egypt turn into blood. And then Pharaoh's magicians show up and do the same thing with some water in some vessels. How? What water? If all the water in the land turned into blood, and so they take some water and say, here, this water that I have is blood. Like, duh. Like, all the water is. Good job. What are you talking about, right? Like, or if you happen to find some fresh water, and like if all the water in wooden bowls is turning into blood, and you have like a glass vial of water and you dump it into a wooden bowl and it turns into blood, that doesn't mean you did it either, right? Like that could be the plague extending to the, no, you didn't do that, magicians. Like, you didn't do that. Like, you want to prove that you have power over this thing, take this bowl of blood and turn it into water, right? Because I guarantee God could turn it back into water. If you have this power, just turn it back. No big deal, just a little bit. Go for it. Just turn it back. But they're not doing that because they don't actually have this power. But Pharaoh is more than happy to say, close enough. Seems like the same thing, whether he really believes that or not, because of course he doesn't want to bow to the crazy suggestions of Moses and Pharaoh. So more on the theme of there's no way these magicians are really doing this or actually demonstrating any meaningful kind of power. From a sign point of view, we've talked about it a little bit already, but it's worth reiterating. As we get into the plagues, um, there's these mean a number of things. These various plagues, they all have some relationship to life and death. Um, we talked originally with this sign about the idea that um, blood is itself life versus, from a sacramental point of view, right? You've got water in baptism, which is cleansing, but it's not like life itself, right? You have your life of a thing, and you get dirty and need cleansing. Water does that, but it doesn't, and it's necessary to live, but it's a necessary but not a sufficient condition to live, right? Like, you need to drink water to live, but water is not the life itself. From their point of view, the blood is the life itself. So you're taking something that is supportive of life, and from it you're just making life. That is a huge deal. From a sign point of view anyway. Beyond that, I'll mention it several more times, I'm sure, but I'm not going to overly dwell on the exact connections. You can find it online and elsewhere, but there's a fairly persuasive view that these various plagues are striking against different Egyptian gods, right? The lists are not always the same in terms of exactly which Egyptian gods, and it's not like super clear cut, right? Which makes it a little less persuasive, but I think the idea holds that for a culture that had deities for all kinds of different things, and, kind of attributed to, it doesn't even matter, because I'm not sure they necessarily always thought that their gods were real, right? You're just attributing the things in nature that you can't understand to a deity, because that's a way to kind of try to understand it, right? It's a framework for trying to understand what's going on more than it's necessarily something that even deserves a ton of worship all the time. It's easier to say, oh yeah, that's just raw, than like freak out about things that you can't imagine having any control over. Or at least so I think. But at any rate, there were deities related to a lot of these things, because the things the plagues strike at are the important things to the foundation of Egyptian culture and society. So there are Egyptian deities associated with all of these things, and God does show his power over all of these things. And so he's definitely is showing that he's superior to any Egyptian gods and, real, whereas they can't do anything about it. And he's taking what has been kind of a loose and not important view of divinity as just sort of, there's some gods around, I guess, to, oh, wait, when this is real, it's totally different. And this one's not messing around. And this is not like our gods. Which is a big deal. And this God really has absolute power over life and death, whereas our gods don't at all. So that idea definitely continues, and the connection isn't unhelpful to think about. It's also not a huge deal, right? I think the life and death aspect of them is a lot more important, but then God one-upping all of these other gods all the time, because if you make it a big contest between the Israelite and the Egyptian gods, you're legitimizing the Egyptian gods too much, right? They don't do anything. So that part of it doesn't even matter. But the manifestation of what God is doing and how it affects the Egyptians matters a lot. How it affects fake Egyptian gods matters a lot. So all of their crops are going to be destroyed, and the thing that's going to get to them is, man, our God of the crops isn't as strong as that one. Or is it going to be, oh wait, I don't have anything to eat, right? But that psychological blow, that's really going to push them over the edge, right? So I think we should stay focused on kind of the practical side of these things that are horrifying and they're happening. And they show God's power over life and death. So Pharaoh goes home unimpressed but unable to do anything about it, and all the Egyptians are scavenging, trying to find anything that they can drink because all the water is blood. There's nothing that they can do about this, right? Like, and you can't claim that the sign isn't a big deal if you can't repeat it or undo it, right? It's a big deal. And that should have been persuasive, right? It's enough to admit your powerlessness in the face of this God if you're being honest with yourself. So of course, Pharaoh is going to repent and let the people go and everything will be fine, right? We know that's not what's going to happen because God told us in advance that's not going to be what's going to happen. But that would be the rational thing to do. Pharaoh's not going to do that. This will potentially be more important. You know, these chapter breaks in these books weren't in the original manuscripts, right? These things were added later and we accept them because it's an easy way to reference different things. But so if this ends on 7 days past after the Lord has struck the Nile, and then we get into the next chapter and it starts talking about what comes next. It wasn't like modern novels where that break was intended by the author, right? This has more bearing. It would be a bad intro, sort of, to the next lesson, but to the next chapter, but it's more relevant there than it is here. For here, the important thing is that sevens in the Bible always talk about a thing that is going to repeat itself. Like a week, you get to the end of a week and then what happens? You have another week and you get to the end of that, what happens? You have another week. It's a repeating cycle of things that never ends. It suggests another thing is coming. So you get to the end of your first plague and it lasts, or spoiler, the plague's going to go away after 7 days. You get to the end of a plague, it's 7 days. That doesn't mean, oh, that was a perfect plague, we're done with that now. That means we're going to have more plagues. And that's sort of where that is pointing. And so we're done with one. We know the number because it's famous, but there is one plague down with a number yet to go. This has been an overview of the Turning to God's Word Bible study. You shall have no other gods, the book of Exodus. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.